At midday, scorching heat enveloped the small town in Texas, with the air thick and oppressive under a hazy layer of dust, forcing people to seek refuge under air conditioners. On the long, straight main road, a sleek black SUV appeared in the distance, the sunlight reflecting off its glossy surface, creating an illusion as if the car were floating above the burning asphalt. Officer Derek Brown sat in his patrol car, boredom creeping into each breath as he lazily sipped iced coffee from a plastic cup. The whole day had been uneventful, with no accidents, no violations, only the sun and an all-encompassing silence. Suddenly, the beep of the speed radar broke the silence. The screen flashed, displaying 72 mph clearly in front of him. The speed limit here was only 55 mph. Brown's eyes lit up, a rush of excitement rising within him. Finally, something was happening. He muttered, "About time," as he set down his coffee, quickly flipped on his police lights, and hit the gas to pursue the luxury SUV up ahead. In Brown's mind, no one could outrun him in this town. He had patrolled here long enough to know every inch, believing he held absolute control. The SUV continued without slowing, but Brown wasn't worried. Confident in his authority, he thought. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. After a dull morning, he finally had a chance to prove himself. Brown's eyes gleamed with satisfaction and pride. At last, the SUV pulled over, and Brown braked sharply, quickly stepping out of his patrol car. Habitually, he adjusted his belt and cap before approaching the vehicle. The black SUV sat still, showing no signs of resistance. The driver's side door slowly opened, and out stepped a tall man. Dressed in a finely tailored dark blue suit that fit his strong frame, he stood with an upright stance and a composed demeanor, making an immediate impression. But Brown didn't notice. To him, this was just another traffic violation. It didn't matter who this man was. His only focus was on performing his duty. Or so he told himself. Brown approached the vehicle, stopping a few steps from the driver, mentally preparing for the usual scenarios: excuses or resistance. Sometimes, drivers in such luxury vehicles acted smugly, or tried to justify their actions. He thought to himself, probably another self-important type. In a familiar tone, Brown demanded, "License and registration," without making eye contact. To Brown, this was just a routine process. Ask for paperwork, issue a ticket, move on. The man said nothing, quietly handing over his documents. As Brown looked at the license, his hand trembled slightly. The name on the license was unbelievable: General Marcus Evans. Brown read the name aloud, his eyes widening. This wasn't an ordinary man. Marcus Evans was a renowned general in the military, having led major campaigns abroad, and was considered a hero by many. Brown had seen him on the news before, but these thoughts only flashed briefly in his mind. Brown's heart pounded faster, partly in shock, but mostly in a wave of growing, inexplicable anger. "You know you broke the law, don't you?" Brown asked coldly, ignoring the rank displayed on the ID. He didn't care who this man was. All he saw was a lawbreaker. The man remained calm, showing no signs of worry. He tilted his head slightly and replied in a steady tone, "I exceeded the speed limit, and fully accept responsibility for that." His voice was soft, and even as if this were merely a simple conversation. But that calmness only fueled Brown's anger. In Brown's mind, thoughts whirled like a storm. Why is he so calm? Who does he think he is? Does he think he can get away with this just because of that rank? Each question was like a pin pricking Brown's pride, aggravating him further. Marcus Evans, the powerful man standing before him, only made him more uncomfortable. Not just for his wealth and success, but also for the confidence, even arrogance, he seemed to radiate. People like Marcus Evans, wealthy, successful, and powerful, had always irritated Brown. He'd seen them from afar, stepping out of luxury mansions, driving expensive cars, living lives he could never imagine having. They seemed to exist in a completely different world, where the law was only an afterthought, not something that applied to them. Brown had seen too many times how people of influence escaped consequences simply due to their status. They acted as if they were above the law, and it drove him mad. Brown had lived a hard life. He came from a poor neighborhood, where each day was a fight for survival. Growing up hadn't been easy. He'd faced injustice, discrimination, and hurdles that only those from the bottom of society understood. To Brown, life was a relentless series of challenges, and he'd had to overcome them on his own without any help from others. Increasingly, he felt the world was unfair, and people like Evans only highlighted the gap between the two worlds, the world of the rich and the world of the poor. As Brown looked directly into Evans' eyes, he saw no worry or fear. Instead, he saw an unsettling calmness. Evans stood there as if everything was under his control, as if he was used to having things go his way without consequence. That calmness felt like a challenge to Brown. He thinks he can stand here, look at me like this, and walk away just because he has money and power? Brown thought, his anger swelling. In those moments, Brown felt all the pent-up emotions he'd held onto for so long bubbling up within him. He had endured too much, years of feeling overlooked by people like Evans. This was his chance to assert his authority, to show that even powerful people weren't exempt from the law. Brown felt he was standing at a crossroads. Either let Evans treat him with disdain, or do something to affirm that the law wasn't just a tool for the wealthy. Brown's mind clouded with rage. He felt he was representing all those who had been wronged by the system. His anger wasn't only directed at Evans, but at society and all the injustices he'd suffered throughout his life. This isn't just about him, Brown told himself. This is about everyone who's ever been looked down on, trampled on like I have. Brown clenched his fists, feeling his muscles tense. He knew this could lead to unpredictable consequences, but at that moment, he didn't care. His fury and desire for justice had overwhelmed his reason. This time, things will be different. I won't let him walk away so easily, Brown thought, his eyes fixed on Evans, who stood there, calm and self-assured, as if untouchable. In that instant, Brown made a decision. He would not allow people like Marcus Evans to continue exploiting their power and status to evade the consequences of their actions. He would do whatever it took to ensure that this time justice would be served, even if it meant paying a high price himself. Brown stood still for a moment, his sharp eyes observing Marcus Evans. A surge of anger rose within him, an inexplicable frustration, perhaps stemming from Evans's calm and composed demeanor. He couldn't stand it. The calmness of the man before him felt like a subtle challenge to his authority. In Brown's mind, the thought that Evans needed to pay for his smug attitude consumed him. Without thinking, Brown took a step closer, nearly face to face with the tall man, and abruptly ordered, his voice tense, "Hands on the car!" Evans looked momentarily surprised by the command, a flicker of confusion flashing in his eyes, but he remained calm. He didn't resist or argue, merely complied quietly, slowly placing his hands on the glossy hood of the black SUV. Yet, in Brown's mind, this action did nothing to quell the fury brewing within him. On the contrary, Evans's calm compliance only heightened Brown's discomfort, as if it subtly undermined the authority he was trying to assert. Does he think he can get away with this just because he's a general? Brown muttered to himself, his anger growing hotter. Unable to contain himself any longer, Brown lunged forward, grabbing Evans's wrist, twisting it behind his back, and pressing him against the car with unnecessary force. "You think you're getting away with this?" Brown yelled, his voice brimming with rage. Regardless of who Marcus Evans was, to Brown, he was just a lawbreaker at that moment. The fact that Evans held a high rank only intensified Brown's anger. It wasn't just about rank. For Brown, Evans symbolized everything he felt was unjust in his life. the wealth, power, and entitlement he lacked. Evans remained composed, even with his hands locked tightly behind him. He offered no resistance, only turned his head to look at Brown, his gaze void of fear or anger. Instead, there was a calmness that agitated Brown even further. "What did I do wrong?" Evans asked, his tone soft but authoritative, making Brown feel as if he'd been drawn into an unintended standoff. That calm question only fanned the flames of Brown's rage further. "Don't act all high and mighty with me!" Brown shouted, tightening his grip on Evans's wrist, pressing him harder against the car. Brown felt a need to assert his power, but Evans's calmness seemed to challenge him, pushing him toward losing control. He'd expected the man before him to resist, or, at the very least, show fear. But Evans's demeanor only heightened his irritation. That unshakable composure reminded Brown of his own life's failures and shortcomings, a life where he always felt left behind. "What did I do wrong?" Evans repeated, this time with a sharper tone, his words cutting not just through Brown's actions, but exposing the irrationality of his anger. Brown paused, a part of him aware that Evans hadn't done anything wrong. He understood that he'd allowed his frustrations to take over, that these actions stemmed not from upholding the law, but from his private resentment, from feeling disregarded and out of control. Yet this self-awareness didn't make him stop. Instead, it strengthened his desire to assert his authority. "I don't have to answer your questions," Brown snapped, his voice tense with unrestrained anger. "Here, I'm the one in charge." Evans remained silent, looking at Brown with an unusual compassion in his eyes. "No, I'm not the one in charge here," Evans said quietly, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "But neither are you." The words lingered heavily in the air. Brown felt as though all the power he thought he held was slipping away. This was no longer a battle over authority or control. It was something deeper, an internal struggle that he couldn't win, no matter how hard he tried. Just then, the sound of a siren echoed from a distance, and another patrol car appeared. Lieutenant John Martinez, a longtime colleague of Brown's, had sensed something unusual about the situation and arrived, recognizing the escalating tension. With years of working alongside Brown, Martinez understood his colleague's temper and realized the situation was spinning out of control. Martinez approached calmly but warily, asking, "Derek, what's going on here?" Brown didn't turn, his disdainful voice responding loudly. "I'm arresting a lawbreaker," he said, gripping Evans's wrist tightly. Seeing Marcus Evans's face, Martinez immediately recognized the problem. His eyes widened in surprise, and he moved quickly, hoping to resolve the situation before it worsened. "Derek, wait a minute," Martinez said, his tone becoming serious. "This is General Marcus Evans." Brown whipped around, his eyes blazing with anger, looking at Martinez with disbelief. "So what?" he asked coldly, his voice filled with defiance. "You think he's getting away just because he's a general?" Brown spat, his gaze filled with resentment. Martinez sensed the tension between the two men and understood the potential danger of the situation. He knew Brown was stubborn and wouldn't be easily swayed, especially when he felt his authority was challenged. But Martinez also understood that confronting a man like General Marcus Evans in this way was completely wrong and could lead to severe consequences, not only for Brown, but for the entire department. Keeping his composure, Martinez lowered his voice and said, "Derek, you know we can't handle this like you're doing. General Evans isn't just any ordinary citizen. He's dedicated his life to this country. We need to handle this situation carefully, or we'll face consequences you can't foresee." But Brown still refused to back down. "Does he think he can do whatever he wants, just because he's a general?" Brown repeated, his voice thick with anger. His pride and stubbornness clouded his judgment. He continued to hold Evans's wrist tightly, as if trying to affirm his authority once again. Martinez realized that words alone wouldn't get through to Brown. He sighed and spoke slowly. "Derek, think about the consequences. If this goes public, you'll be held responsible. Remember, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing the entire police force. Don't let your emotions lead you down a path you'll regret." The truth in Martinez's words began to sink into Brown's mind, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Brown looked directly at Evans, his eyes still filled with resentment, but a slight hesitation flickered across his face. He realized he was pushing too far, but his anger and ego continued to battle within him, making it difficult to back down right away. Evans stood silently, his gaze steady and calm, which only added to Brown's unease, but also made him reconsider his actions. Just then, another car pulled up on the opposite side of the street. From inside, a man in a suit emerged, holding a video camera. It was a reporter, likely from a local news station or newspaper. He quickly set up his camera and began recording the scene in front of him. Brown caught a glimpse of the camera pointed his way, and this only fueled his frustration. The pressure of being filmed publicly pushed him closer to losing control. He felt as though every eye was on him, judging his every move. Martinez recognized that things were spiraling badly. If Brown didn't stop now, the consequences would be severe. He stepped closer, placing a hand on Brown's shoulder, his tone more firm. "Derek, stop. Don't do something you'll regret." But Brown was consumed by pride and uncontrollable anger. He jerked his shoulder, shaking off Martinez's hand, turning back abruptly to shout, "I'm in control here. You have no right to interfere." But no matter how forceful his words were, they couldn't conceal the confusion in Brown's eyes. As Brown continued to shout, Martinez realized that any further attempt to persuade him would be useless. The reporter kept filming, and the scene was beginning to attract the attention of passers-by. Some people had stopped, pulling out their phones to record, adding to the pressure on Brown. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It had become a public spectacle, and Martinez knew that if they didn't stop now, Brown's career could be ruined. Marcus Evans remained still, his hands restrained behind his back, but his gaze was calm, looking straight at Derek Brown, as if he could read every thought in the officer's mind. His eyes held no fear or anger. Instead, they conveyed resolve and understanding. To Brown, this felt like a silent challenge, provoking deep-seated frustrations he could no longer control. Evans tilted his head slightly, his voice calm, but filled with authority. "Officer, you need to understand that your actions will have serious consequences. Not because I am a general, but because I am a citizen of this country. You cannot violate my rights just because of your anger." Marcus's words hit Brown's pride like a hard blow, making him feel as though all his authority was slipping away. Evans's composure only made Brown angrier, and he felt himself losing control over the situation. Chaotic thoughts began to fill his mind, that he had gone too far, that things were spiraling beyond his grasp. But his anger and pride wouldn't let him admit his mistake. He couldn't stop now, couldn't let Marcus Evans win, even in a mental standoff. In this moment, Brown saw Marcus not as a mere traffic violator, but as the embodiment of everything he despised in life: power, wealth, and confidence that he'd never possessed. Evans, keeping his calm tone, continued, "Do you think that using force will get you out of this? We all have responsibilities under the law, and so do I. But I won't allow anyone, not even a police officer, to infringe on my rights without just cause." Those words pierced Brown's pride like needles, igniting his rage. He felt humiliated in front of his colleague, and, worse, in front of bystanders. A sense of confusion crept into his mind, but his ego and anger drowned out any warning signs. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Brown growled, trying to maintain control while gripping Evans's wrist even tighter. "I won't let you get away with this." Yet, deep down, Brown began to feel he'd gone too far. The clear signals from his colleague Martinez and the presence of onlookers filming the incident increased the pressure on him. Martinez's eyes were full of caution as he stood beside Brown, clearly trying to end the confrontation before it became irreversible. "Derek, stop," Martinez said, his voice more serious. "We can't go on like this. Let him go before things get worse." Brown stood still, glancing at Martinez, torn. He knew Martinez was right. The situation had escalated beyond his control, but his pride and anger held him hostage, driving him deeper into his mistake. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let this man win, nor could he let people think he was weak. "No," Brown muttered, his voice hardening. "He thinks he can walk away just because he's a general? I won't allow it." But even as he said those words, Brown realized the situation had gone too far. His pride had led him down this path, but now he felt trapped by a snare of his own making. Marcus Evans, although restrained, remained unshaken. He stood there calmly, under the mounting pressure, neither panicked nor fearful. He knew he was being treated unjustly, but he also understood that the law would stand with him. "Officer Brown," Marcus spoke, his voice breaking the tense silence. "I will not resist or cause trouble, but you need to understand that your actions today will have serious consequences. I don't want you to lose your job, but if you persist, the repercussions will be unavoidable." Those words poured fuel onto Brown's anger, but this time, instead of flaming up, the anger began to dissolve into fear. He realized he had pushed this situation too far. The voices in his head grew clearer. "Stop before it's too late." But his pride and anger had led him too far to turn back. He stood there, rigid, unsure of his next move. Seeing the struggle in Brown's eyes, Martinez stepped closer, this time his voice firm. "Derek, stop now. Let him go. Don't do something you'll regret for the rest of your life." Martinez's words acted like an anchor, grounding what little rationality remained in Brown's mind. With a sigh, he loosened his grip on Marcus Evans's wrist and slowly stepped back. "All right," he murmured, his voice now lacking the authority it once held. "You can go." Marcus Evans said nothing more. He looked at Brown for a moment, his eyes reflecting disappointment, not out of anger or contempt, but from seeing someone who had allowed pride and anger to cloud his judgment. Evans slowly turned back, walked to his SUV, opened the door, and sat down in the driver's seat. As he started the engine and drove away, no one spoke, but the atmosphere hung heavy with unspoken words. As Evans left, Brown felt as though the world had collapsed around him. He returned to his patrol car, sitting silently in the driver's seat. His hands shook as they gripped the steering wheel. A whirlwind of emotions, anger, shame, fear, swirled in his mind. He knew he'd lost, not only in this confrontation with Marcus Evans, but against himself. John Martinez stood outside Brown's car for a moment, looking at his colleague with a worried expression. "Derek, you went too far," Martinez said softly, his tone gentle, but weighted with significance. "This isn't going to end easily." Brown didn't respond. He stared blankly ahead, his mind foggy with conflicting thoughts. He knew the damage was too severe to be repaired. The sense of defeat began to haunt him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Brown had once been a confident, decisive officer, but now all that remained was doubt and instability. He felt a sense of loss, not just over his position, but his self-respect, over how he thought he should act. He had always believed that he enforced the law with necessary firmness. But today, everything changed. He realized the anger within him was no longer under control. It had turned him into someone he no longer recognized. A few hours later, the video of the confrontation had already spread widely on social media. The reporter, along with bystanders, had recorded the entire incident, and the footage of Brown, a police officer abusing his power, arresting a general with irrational anger, quickly became a topic of discussion across various platforms. Criticism poured in from every angle, not only from strangers online, but also from his colleagues and superiors. Things happened too quickly for Brown to react. He had once believed that his position as a police officer gave him authority, but he had never considered the consequences of misusing that power. Each comment, each criticism on social media, was like a punch to his soul, gradually dismantling the pride he had built throughout his career. Brown was no longer just an officer. He had now become a symbol of abuse of power and injustice in the public's eye. When Brown returned to the police station, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. He could sense a clear change in the attitude of his colleagues, whom he had once considered friends. No one said anything, but the way they avoided his gaze, and the tense silence that fell whenever he walked in, made everything worse. Even the daily greetings had vanished. A few people stopped, glancing at him discreetly before quickly turning away, as if not wanting to associate with someone who'd been marked. Brown entered the office, trying to act as if everything was normal, though he knew it wasn't. He walked to his desk, sat down, and attempted to focus on the unfinished reports, but each line he looked at was blurred. His mind kept spinning back to the confrontation with Evans and the consequences it would bring. Deep down, he knew nothing would ever be the same. Just a few minutes after he sat down, a cold voice spoke behind him. "Brown, in my office, now." It was the voice of Captain Harkness, head of the station. His voice wasn't loud, but carried an unmistakable gravity. Brown stood up, trying to stay calm as he walked into the captain's office. The door closed behind him, and he could feel the weight in the air. Captain Harkness didn't look at him right away, instead flipping through a stack of papers on his desk, before finally looking up to focus on Brown. On the desk lay the morning newspaper with a large headline, "Police Brutality Against General Marcus Evans Sparks Outrage." The photo of Brown and Evans on the front page made him feel as though his world was collapsing. "Are you aware that your video has spread everywhere, Derek?" Captain Harkness asked, his voice icy. Brown didn't reply. He only nodded, feeling as if his chest were being crushed. "This isn't just a small mistake, Derek," Harkness continued, his eyes never leaving Brown. "You've brought this department into a massive scandal, and this isn't just about you. It affects all of us. General Marcus Evans is no ordinary citizen. He's a national symbol. And you've turned yourself into a symbol of abuse of power and racial prejudice." These words struck at Brown's pride like a hammer. He wanted to respond, to justify himself, but he knew that nothing he said would change the situation. Captain Harkness took a deep breath before continuing. "I've received calls from the top, and I don't need to tell you what that means. We're under investigation, and you are suspended immediately until the investigation is complete." Brown sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists under the table. "Suspended," he stammered, his voice trembling. It felt like a death sentence for his career. He had known this was coming, but hearing it directly from the captain made it painfully real. It wasn't just his career at stake. His entire life seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. "Derek, I can't cover for you on this," Harkness said, his tone softening slightly. "This investigation will go very deep, and it's not just about the incident with General Evans. They'll look at every case you've ever worked on. And if there's anything unusual..." Harkness didn't need to finish the sentence. Brown knew all too well what that implied. This wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about his entire career. Every decision and every action he had taken over the years would be scrutinized. And if there was any sign of misconduct or abuse, it would be the end of everything. Brown walked out of the office with a heavy heart. His steps were leaden, as though each step was a mile, and he wasn't sure he could keep going. He knew he'd lost his career, and that alone was devastating. But what haunted him more was that he had become a symbol of the very things he had always believed he was fighting against: abuse of power, racial prejudice, and injustice. He had once seen himself as an enforcer of the law, But now he was branded as someone who destroyed the fairness he once swore to protect. When Brown returned to his desk, there was no trace left of the pride he once felt sitting in that chair. Instead, he sat blankly, staring into space. The colleagues who had once been close to him now avoided him. No one looked him in the eye anymore. No one started a casual conversation. Every time he entered a room, conversation ceased. The glances, the unspoken silences, all of it suffocated him. He had once been part of a team, someone his colleagues respected. But now, he was an outsider, someone no one wanted to be associated with. Fear and pressure began to consume Brown's mind. At first, he thought he could get through it, that the investigation would end soon, and everything would go back to normal. But reality was far from what he imagined. With each passing day, the pressure grew heavier. He couldn't escape the feeling that his career was collapsing, not just because of the investigation, but because of the way he was being ostracized by the very people he once considered friends and teammates. Those who had once seen him as one of their own now looked at him as a stain on the department's honor. Every evening, Brown returned home more broken than when he'd left for work. The sense of loneliness and despair closed in on him. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but that only made things worse. The video of the confrontation with Marcus Evans continued to circulate widely on social media, and each time he opened his phone, he was bombarded with angry comments, criticisms, and even threats. Every line felt like a punch to his psyche. The death threats and the hateful words made it impossible for him to ignore the reality that he had become a pariah in the community. In both work and personal life, Brown was gradually becoming isolated. He no longer dared to go to public places, because every time he went outside, he felt the wary eyes of strangers upon him. Old friends didn't want to stay in touch. Even his family didn't know how to help him through the storm of public outrage. Loneliness surrounded him, each morning feeling like a struggle. There was a time when Brown woke up with excitement, proud of the work he did. But now, he had to fight himself to find a reason to get out of bed, to keep moving forward in a world where every door seemed shut in his face. The guilt began to weigh heavily. Brown replayed the confrontation with Marcus Evans in his mind, each moment replaying like an unending nightmare. He couldn't deny that he had made a mistake, that he had failed to keep his cool and acted on impulse and bias. That was the moment he stopped being a police officer who served justice and became someone who abused power. And now, the price for that moment was his career, his honor, and his life as he knew it. Day after day, Brown felt the change within himself. He was no longer the strong, confident man he used to be. The anxieties and guilt over his mistake pushed him deeper into despair. He knew there was no escape from this situation. The investigation would drag on, and regardless of the outcome, he had been branded with a reputation he couldn't erase. He had destroyed his career and life with his own hands, and now everything was falling apart before him, with no way to repair it. In rare moments of clarity, Brown realized he was living in a nightmare of his own making. It wasn't just his career and honor that were ruined. Even his self-respect and belief in himself had shattered. The values he once believed in, once protected, were now the very things he had betrayed. Brown had once been a police officer with dreams of delivering justice. But now, he was only a shadow of his former self, lost in isolation, regret, and despair. As each endless day passed, the news about the incident with General Marcus Evans continued to flood the media and social networks. Each time Brown checked his phone or watched the news, he saw his image, a police officer abusing his power against a famous general, plastered across news sites. The pressure from the public and within the police department only intensified, but what weighed on him most was the bleak future ahead. One morning, as Brown sat at his kitchen table, trying not to dwell on the consequences looming over him, a loud knock jolted him from his thoughts. Slowly, he went to the door, heart pounding with a sense of impending dread. Opening it, he found two men in sharp suits, their expressions solemn. One of them spoke. "Officer Derek Brown, we are FBI agents and have a few questions regarding the incident with General Marcus Evans." The agent's words struck like a final alarm bell. Brown stood still, trying to process what he'd just heard. The FBI. This meant the investigation had gone further than he had imagined. They weren't only interested in the incident with Evans, they were likely digging into every action in his past. Brown knew this would not end well. He invited the agents inside, attempting to keep his composure. They sat at his living room table and wasted no time in starting the interrogation. "We need to understand why you felt the need to use force on General Evans in that situation," one agent began, his voice cold and sharp. Brown took a deep breath, trying to answer. "He was violating traffic laws, and I was just following protocol." "We've seen the video," the other agent interrupted, his eyes watching every reaction on Brown's face. "There was no justification for you to use force on General Evans, especially when he offered no resistance. So why did you feel it was necessary?" That question cut into Brown's pride like a blade. He had asked himself the same thing countless times over the past few days, but each time he did, everything remained blurry. He couldn't give a clear answer because, from the start, his decision to use force had no reasonable justification. Stumbling over his words, Brown responded, I thought he was hiding something. I acted on instinct." "Instinct?" the agent repeated, his eyes filled with skepticism. "Your instinct told you that arresting and treating someone roughly without evidence, simply because of who they were, was the right thing to do?" Brown's sense of unease grew with each passing moment. He wanted to argue, to justify it as a mistake, that he hadn't intended for things to go this far. But deep down, he knew that any words he said now were meaningless. He had crossed the line between law enforcement and abuse of power. The interrogation went on, each question pushing Brown further into the hole he had dug himself into. The agents didn't stop at the Evans incident. They wanted to examine Brown's entire career. "We will be reviewing every case you've worked on. If we find any signs of abuse of power or misconduct, you will be held accountable," one of the agents said, his tone final and unforgiving. Those words echoed in Brown's mind like a death knell. "All my previous cases," he repeated in shock. This meant that every action throughout his police career would be scrutinized, and every decision and every situation he'd been involved in would be brought to light. He knew there had been times when he crossed the line, moments where he let emotions override his judgment, and now all those instances were coming back to haunt him. After the interrogation ended, Brown felt as though the world had collapsed onto his shoulders. The agents had left, but the silence in his quiet home was more suffocating and heavy than ever. Everything around him seemed silent, but his mind was a storm, sweeping away every thought. He sat down on the couch, his hands shaking, palms damp with sweat. His heartbeat was still racing, each beat driving him deeper into a sense of helplessness. Brown stared blankly into the distance, unsure how to begin facing this harsh reality. The investigation wasn't only about Marcus Evans, a regrettable mistake in his career, but had now opened a dark door to his past. Incidents he had tried to forget, wrong decisions he thought would remain buried, were now resurfacing, threatening to destroy everything. He couldn't stop himself from recalling past mistakes, moments when he had lost his temper and acted recklessly under the pressures of the job and pride. Throughout his career, he had convinced himself that these errors were only minor blemishes on a larger picture of dedication and service. But now, they felt like gaping wounds laid bare before those investigating him. They would dig it all up, bringing everything to light as evidence against him. An invisible fear began to tighten around Brown's mind and heart. He knew exactly what lay ahead. Those he once counted as colleagues might no longer stand by him when the investigation went public. The media and public opinion, all would turn against him, criticizing and condemning actions he'd thought no one would notice. His career, something he had poured sweat, tears, and even sacrificed his personal life to build, now teetered on the edge of collapse. A long road, a journey full of hardships he had traveled, was now one step away from crumbling to ash. Thoughts of a dark future weighed down his mind. It wasn't only his career at stake, but also his personal life, the relationships he had worked hard to maintain. His reputation, which he had tried so hard to protect, now faced the risk of being torn apart, piece by piece. He no longer controlled his life. Even his self-respect was slipping away, and that might have been the most painful loss of all. Brown felt like a ship lost in a vast sea, directionless, pushed adrift by the storms of life. His future was now shrouded in darkness, with no light to guide him. He had always prided himself on maintaining control over his life, but now everything was out of reach. Mistakes from his past were closing in, giving him no escape, not even the faintest glimmer of hope. Sitting quietly in the darkness of his house, Brown couldn't escape the overwhelming guilt consuming his soul. Every mistake, every moment of weakness seemed to resurface all at once, pushing him deeper into fear. He had once believed that he could keep control, but now his future was no longer in his own hands. It lay in the hands of those who would judge him, those who would decide whether he was worthy of forgiveness or would have to face total ruin. A sense of confusion began to swell within Brown. He thought about the decisions that had led him to this moment. Once, he had been respected in the community as a man who prided himself on his integrity. But gradually, arrogance and the pressures of life caused him to lose his way. The words and actions he had once dismissed as insignificant were now weighing heavily on his conscience, impossible to erase. Brown couldn't stop asking himself, "How did I end up here?" Desperation slowly started to creep into every corner of his mind. He looked around the darkened house, once a warm home, now just a space filled with sadness and loss. Memories of happier days, when he had been confident and strong, felt like distant shadows haunting his thoughts. Back then, he thought himself invincible, that no one could ever shake his position. But now, all he had left was a profound sense of loss. Brown felt like he had lost everything: his career, his dignity, and most importantly, the belief in his worth, had all abandoned him. There was no more certainty, no more self-respect, and no longer the burning dreams he once held. He wondered if he could find his way back, or if he would remain buried under the weight of his past mistakes. The laughter and congratulations that once filled his life with success now felt like faint echoes. Brown knew he couldn't turn back time, but what hurt him the most was the uncertainty of whether he could ever make amends, whether there was any chance left to fix things. Loneliness weighed on him like an invisible cloak, impossible to remove. Every time Brown tried to stand and face reality, fear pulled him back down. He felt trapped in a vicious cycle of regret and self-punishment. With no friends left to confide in, and no colleagues to trust, Brown realized he had isolated himself through his own wrong decisions. Now, this house, once a refuge after long days of work, had become a prison for his soul. He wondered if anyone could understand the pain he was carrying. Was there anyone out there, in the outside world, who could sympathize and offer him a second chance? Or would he have to face a life of being forgotten, where nothing remained but the whispers of failure? Trust in himself had completely shattered. Brown had not only lost the trust of others, but he had also lost the ability to trust himself. Every action, every word he had, spoken in the past, now felt like sharp needles, piercing deep into his soul. He couldn't comprehend how he had let everything spiral out of control to such an extent. But deep down, a small flicker of hope remained. Faint as it was the only thing preventing him from plunging fully into the depths of despair. Brown knew that he had to face his mistakes, no matter how difficult it would be. He couldn't change the past, but the future was still there, and only he could decide how to move forward. "I can't give up now," Brown told himself, his eyes fixed on the empty void in front of him, desperately holding on to the sliver of hope that lingered. In the overwhelming darkness, Brown sat there, reflecting on his mistakes and the possibility of redemption, with one question echoing in his mind. Could he change, or would he forever be imprisoned by the mistakes he had made? The undeniable truth was that his career, which he had tried so hard to protect, was crumbling day by day, hour by hour. And his greatest fear was that things would only get worse. As he suspected, the situation no longer centered around the confrontation with General Marcus Evans. Marcus Evans's actions had sparked an unstoppable wave, but the worst consequences fell on Derek Brown's shoulders. He no longer faced only the loss of his career, but also the outrage of an entire society. A sense of lost control surrounded him, and the fears he had harbored now burst into full-blown panic. Everything he'd tried to protect, his career, his honor, even his personal life, was collapsing like a sandcastle swept away by a raging wave. First came the isolation. Colleagues at the police station began avoiding him. Those who once saw him as a good officer now turned away, fearing association with him would harm their careers. Office gossip, once minor chatter, had turned into open conversations of condemnation and criticism. He felt that every gaze was a judgment, and no one trusted him anymore. Even his family couldn't escape the impact. His wife, who had once been proud of him, could no longer hide her worry and disappointment. Their children began sensing the distance from friends, the hushed whispers about their father. Derek realized that not only his career, but also his family was caught up in this storm of public scrutiny. He felt guilt, but also helplessness, unable to shield them from the consequences he had brought upon them. Work at the station quickly became a burden. The responsibilities, already heavy, grew more oppressive as he faced the fallout of his decisions. Although he still came to work every day, he was no longer assigned significant duties. People handed him trivial tasks, as if he were no longer trusted with important matters. Worse, internal investigations began, not only into the incident with General Marcus Evans, but into his other actions in the past. Every mistake he had ever made, no matter how small, was now unearthed, strengthening the image of him as an abusive, racially prejudiced officer. The ongoing pressure led Derek to start questioning himself. He had once believed that everything he did was to protect justice, driven by duty. But now, faced with harsh reality, he couldn't deny that he had abused his power, allowing his biases to guide his actions. But was there a way back? Could his belated remorse change anything in a situation that had already gone too far? For Marcus Evans, the incident with Brown had made him a symbol of the fight for justice. He not only gained media attention, but also the strong support of human rights organizations. His patience and determination inspired many people of color and other marginalized communities. Evans began appearing in speaking engagements, joining campaigns for police reform. He tirelessly advocated for transparency and accountability in law enforcement, and his story became the catalyst for a movement demanding sweeping change. Protests erupted not only over Marcus Evans's incident, but from long-standing anger towards similar abuses. Brown, though under investigation and facing departmental consequences, was still targeted by public anger. Protesters demanded not only punishment for Brown, but also a reformation of the entire system to prevent future occurrences. The issue didn't stop at protests. It sparked widespread debate about racial bias and abuse of power within the police force. Politicians, social activists, and the public engaged in discussions on reforming the system. Many began scrutinizing the police's operational methods and calling for systemic changes to ensure human rights were protected fairly, without discrimination based on skin color or social status. In press interviews, Marcus Evans not only recounted the details of his encounter with Brown, but also called for greater public awareness of abuse in law enforcement. He became a figurehead for the movement against police brutality, using his experience to highlight that this was not merely an individual's mistake, but a systemic issue. "This isn't just something that happened to me," Evans said on television, "but something that people of color face daily. We need change, not only to prevent future incidents like this, but to reform the entire system, ensuring that justice is truly served." Evans's words fueled public outrage. Brown, once an ordinary police officer, now symbolized injustice, racial bias, and abuse within the U.S. police system. He was no longer just an individual, but had become the face of everything society was protesting. Demonstrations erupted in various places, and his name was continuously mentioned on signs and banners. The media kept revisiting the incident, with images of Brown and Marcus Evans flooding every outlet. Brown couldn't escape the news. Even when he turned off his phone and avoided social media, the news surrounded him from all sides. TV, radio, and even old friends sent messages, either asking about the incident or showing contempt. Every day felt like an unending nightmare. He tried to salvage what little dignity remained, but every effort was in vain. One afternoon, sitting in his quiet house, Brown couldn't look away from the TV screen as he saw General Marcus Evans appear on a national television channel. It wasn't the first time he'd seen the general in public, but this time was different. It wasn't just a story of a confrontation. This was an in-depth interview, exploring Evans's reflections on the injustices he faced and society's reaction. In the televised interview, General Evans showed no anger or hostility. He spoke with a calm yet firm tone. He didn't merely recount the incident caused by Brown, but expanded the conversation into a larger discussion on the abuse and discrimination that Black people and other minorities endure. Not only did this worry Brown, but it also filled him with shame before the public. Evans explained that the injustice he faced wasn't just an isolated incident, but indicative of a deeper problem within society. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has endured discrimination and abuse without a voice," he said, his eyes reflecting determination. "We can't let incidents like this happen without a response. It's time for a profound change in how we treat each other and within our justice system." Brown sat there, stunned by what he was hearing. He had never imagined that his actions could lead to such far-reaching consequences. He had seen himself as someone powerful in his neighborhood, someone who could enforce his will when he felt disrespected. But now, the man he had sought to control was on a national platform, turning a personal story into a rallying cry for social change. And that was what frightened Brown most. Marcus Evans went on to emphasize the importance of building a society where everyone, regardless of race or background, could live and thrive fairly. "I'm not speaking just for myself. I want this incident to be a catalyst for society as a whole," he said with conviction. "We can't allow abuses of this nature to continue unchecked." Those words hit Brown's conscience like a heavy blow. He realized his actions were far more than a minor misunderstanding or a situation that could be easily brushed aside. They had become a symbol of everything wrong within society, the abuse of power and racial discrimination that many endure daily. In the following days, Brown couldn't shake off his anxiety and fear. He began to feel his neighbors' gaze on him differently, and the worst part was the public exposure of his identity as a racist, abusive figure. He didn't know how to face the situation. Regret? Justification? He wasn't sure anymore. Meanwhile, the movement that General Marcus Evans had sparked continued to grow. Discussions, forums, and protests against racial discrimination and abuse erupted everywhere. The small event that Brown once thought insignificant had become the starting point for a new social revolution. The entire neighborhood, even the city, became more aware of the injustices they had ignored for too long. Brown's mind was now filled only with fear, the feeling that his world had changed forever. There was no longer room for discrimination or unchecked power as he once believed he had. For General Marcus Evans, he had turned a personal incident into an opportunity to drive societal change, forcing Brown and others like him to rethink how they live and treat others. Brown felt everything around him slowly closing in, an invisible wall of prejudice and criticism pressing down on him bit by bit. Evans's words had pushed him into an inescapable position. Previously, he could brush off distant murmurs, but now the criticisms rang out louder than ever. No matter where he went, no matter how far he tried to run, his actions would follow him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Initially, Brown had considered leaving town, moving somewhere far away, where no one knew him, where he could start over. A new place with strangers, where his past wouldn't haunt him every day. But reality is never that simple. No matter where he went, Brown understood that what had happened would always be a part of him. It wasn't just the criticisms from the media, colleagues, or the community. It was the guilt and regret he would face each day. That feeling was a weight he could never shed, present every moment he was awake. Every time he looked in the mirror, Brown no longer saw himself as before. Now he only saw a man consumed by pride and anger, who allowed those emotions to destroy everything he had tried to build. The face in the mirror was no longer that of a proud police officer, but of a man breaking apart, piece by piece. Brown's isolation grew more pronounced after the incident. Calls from friends gradually faded, and words of encouragement had turned to haunting silence. Colleagues at the station, who once chatted freely with him, now avoided him whenever he appeared. They looked at him with haunted eyes, as if he were a criminal, not a colleague. Brown understood they weren't saying anything, but judgment was clear in every look, in every movement when they avoided him. Loneliness consumed Brown, pushing him deeper into despair. He had thought himself strong enough to withstand any challenge, but now he realized he was completely powerless in his current situation. In the past, he had been the one in control, the one making decisions, but now he was controlled by his emotions and the guilt of his actions. Brown had tried to find ways to ease the unease in his soul, but nothing could diminish the growing emptiness inside him. He sat alone in the quiet of his house, reflecting on what had happened and wondering if there was any way to make amends. But each time that thought crossed his mind, he quickly realized that all doors had closed on him. There was no way back, no opportunity for a fresh start. It was like an endless downward spiral. Each step he took seemed only to make the scorn from others clearer, and each time he faced himself, the guilt grew deeper. In the end, Brown realized that change had to come from within. But that was far too difficult when everything he had once believed in and built had crumbled beneath him. At that moment, Brown no longer thought about the future or any plan. He just knew that he was trapped in a reality he could no longer control. The sense of despair engulfed him, pulling him deeper into the darkness of his mind. Brown knew his life would never return to what it had been. No matter how far he ran from town or tried to forget what had happened, his actions would follow him like a ghost. No forgiveness could be large enough to free him from this guilt. The image of Marcus Evans, calm and confident, constantly flashed in his mind, reminding him that he had lost everything. And the worst part was, he knew that could never change. Derek Brown, once a proud police officer, was now just a shadow of his former self. He was no longer the one in control of the situation. Instead, he had become the victim of his thoughtless actions and abuse of power. The nightmare he lived in was not something he could escape, and he knew that from that moment on, his life would be forever lost in the shadows of unforgivable mistakes. Brown recalled the moment when everything started to go wrong. One decision, one careless action in a split second, had thrown his life into a pit from which there was no return. As he looked into the mirror, He no longer recognized himself. The proud, confident man who once believed in justice and the law was now only filled with shame and failure. His eyes, once symbols of determination and authority, now reflected only emptiness. Brown sat silently in his living room, his eyes gazing out the window as the sunset faded. Each passing moment felt like a knife cutting deeper into his conscience. He couldn't escape the thoughts of Marcus and his composure throughout the ordeal. Marcus had never been afraid, never appeared weak in the face of Brown's power. Instead, it was Brown who had crumbled under the weight of his actions. He wondered if there was any way to atone for what he had done. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless he felt. There was no way to change the past, and that realization weighed heavily on his mind every day. Was there another path for Brown? Could he find redemption, or would he forever be haunted by his unforgivable mistakes? These questions swirled in his mind, with no clear answers, only a deep sense of emptiness and despair. Brown sat there in silence, feeling each minute, each second pass, knowing that from now on, his life would never be the same again. What a dramatic and emotionally powerful story. The officer's actions not only sparked outrage, but also brought about a powerful response from justice. Do you think this officer has learned a valuable lesson from his actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and meaningful, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to not miss out on more captivating content. Thank you for watching.
The flashing lights in his rearview mirror made Judge Marcus Thompson's heart sink. He'd been driving home after a long day in court, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. Now, those pulsing red and blues threatened to shatter his peace. As he pulled over, Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself of who he was, a respected judge, a pillar of the community. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. He was just another black man being pulled over by the police. Officer Mike Brennan approached the vehicle, flashlight in hand. He'd been on the force for 15 years and thought he'd seen it all. But something about this stop felt different. The car was expensive, the man behind the wheel well-dressed. Still, Brennan's instincts were on high alert. License and registration, he barked, shining the light directly in Marcus's face. Marcus squinted against the glare, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" Brennan ignored the question. "I said license and registration. Now." The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus handed over his documents. He could feel his palms growing sweaty, his heart racing. He'd heard too many stories of routine traffic stops gone wrong. Would this be another? As Brennan studied the license, his eyes widened in surprise. Judge Marcus Thompson. He heard that name before, seen it in the papers. This was no ordinary traffic stop. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Brennan ordered, his voice tight. Marcus hesitated. "Officer, I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong." "I won't ask again. Step out of the vehicle." With a heavy sigh, Marcus complied. As he stood beside his car, he couldn't help but notice the curious stares from passing vehicles. What did they see? A criminal? A threat? Or just a black man being harassed by the police? Brennan circled Marcus, his eyes scanning for any sign of a threat. But all he saw was a man in an expensive suit, looking tired and frustrated. "Do you know why I pulled you over, Judge Thompson?" The use of his title caught Marcus off guard. "No, officer, I don't. I was obeying all traffic laws." Brennan's jaw clenched. "Your taillight is out. But that's not the real reason I stopped you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Here it comes, he thought. The real reason. "I stopped you because—" Brennan paused, struggling with his words. "Because I saw a black man driving an expensive car in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I made an assumption." The admission hung in the air between them. Marcus was stunned into silence. He'd expected excuses, maybe even hostility, but not this. Brennan continued, his voice low. "I've been on this job a long time, Judge. I've seen things that make a man cynical. But tonight I realized I've been part of the problem." As the two men stood there on the side of the road, an unlikely conversation began to unfold. Marcus, drawing on years of experience in the courtroom, found himself listening to Brennan's story. The officer spoke of his upbringing, his training, and the subtle biases that had shaped his worldview. "I'm not a bad person," Brennan insisted, his eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time. "But I've done bad things, made bad judgments, and it's time I faced that." Marcus nodded slowly. "Admitting there's a problem is the first step, Officer Brennan, but it can't end there." As they talked, cars continued to pass by. Some slowed down, curious about the scene unfolding on the roadside. A black man and a white police officer engaged in what appeared to be a civil conversation. It wasn't something you saw every day. The discussion touched on topics that went far beyond a simple traffic stop. They talked about systemic racism, about the fears that black parents have for their children, about the challenges faced by police officers trying to do their job in an increasingly complex world. "I have a son," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every time he leaves the house, I worry. Will this be the day he encounters someone who sees him as a threat, simply because of the color of his skin?" Brennan listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. He thought about his own children, about the privileges they enjoyed without even realizing it. As their conversation drew to a close, both men felt a shift in the air. Something had changed, not just between them, but within them. "Judge Thompson," Brennan said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my gratitude. This conversation, it's opened my eyes." Marcus shook the officer's hand, a small smile playing at his lips. "It's a start, Officer Brennan, but there's still a long way to go." As Marcus prepared to leave, Brennan surprised him with one last question. "Judge, I was wondering, would you be willing to speak at our next department training session? I think your perspective could make a real difference." The request caught Marcus off guard. He'd spent years working within the system, trying to effect change from the bench. But this was an opportunity to reach officers directly, to share his experiences, and hopefully make a lasting impact. "I'd be honored," Marcus replied, feeling a glimmer of hope for the future. As he drove away, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected turn of events. What had started as a frightening and potentially dangerous situation had transformed into something else entirely. A moment of understanding, a chance for growth, a small step towards healing the deep-seated wounds that divided their community. But as he pulled into his driveway, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. One conversation, no matter how powerful, couldn't undo years of systemic injustice. The real work was yet to come. As he walked towards his front door, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Officer Brennan. "Thank you for tonight," it read. "I'm ready to learn, to change. Where do we go from here?" Marcus paused, his hand on the doorknob. Where do we go from here? It was a question that echoed through history, asked by generations of those fighting for equality and justice. And now, in this small corner of the world, two unlikely allies were prepared to tackle it head-on. The story of Judge Marcus Thompson and Officer Mike Brennan was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And as word of their roadside encounter began to spread, neither man could have predicted the ripple effect it would have on their community, their department, and ultimately, on the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. What started as a routine traffic stop had become something much more significant, but the question remained. In a world so deeply divided, could this unexpected connection between a black judge and a white police officer truly make a difference? Or would the entrenched systems of power and prejudice prove too strong to overcome? As Marcus finally entered his home, greeted by the warmth of his family, he knew that the answers to these questions lay in the days and weeks ahead. The journey would be challenging, the obstacles numerous. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of genuine hope. Sometimes, change begins with a single conversation, and tonight, on a quiet suburban street, that conversation had finally started. The next morning, Judge Marcus Thompson sat in his chambers, staring out the window. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind. He barely slept, tossing and turning as he replayed his conversation with Officer Brennan. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but the reality of it all hit him as he scrolled through his phone, reading the text message from Brennan once again. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, straightening his robes. His clerk, Sarah, poked her head in. "Judge, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Marcus furrowed his brow. He didn't have any appointments scheduled this early. "Who is it?" Sarah hesitated. It's a police officer, sir. Officer Brennan." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. What could Brennan want? Had he changed his mind about their conversation? Was this some kind of trap? "Send him in," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. Brennan entered, looking uncomfortable in his civilian clothes. He clutched a manila folder in his hands, knuckles white with tension. "Judge Thompson," he began, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Marcus gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Officer Brennan?" Brennan took a deep breath. "After our talk last night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said, about the fears black parents have for their children, and then I remembered something. A case from a few years back." He placed the folder on Marcus's desk. "I think you need to see this." With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, Marcus opened the folder. Inside were police reports, witness statements, and photographs. As he scanned the documents, his blood ran cold. The case involved a young black man, barely out of his teens, who had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence was flimsy at best, but the boy had been railroaded through the system, pressured into taking a plea deal that sent him to prison for 5 years. "I was there," Brennan said quietly. "I was part of the arrest team, and I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't speak up." Marcus looked up from the papers, his eyes sharp. "Why are you showing me this now?" Brennan swallowed hard. "Because that young man? He's being released next month, and I can't let this injustice stand." The weight of Brennan's words hung in the air. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about years of systemic abuse, of lives ruined by prejudice and silence. "Do you understand what you're saying, Officer Brennan? The implications of this?" Marcus asked. Brennan nodded. "I do, and I'm ready to face the consequences. But more than that, I want to make it right." As they discussed the case, neither man noticed Sarah hovering outside the door, her ear pressed against the wood. Her eyes widened as she caught snippets of their conversation. This was big. Bigger than anything she'd encountered in her time working for the judge. Across town, in the police precinct, whispers were already starting to circulate. Officers who had seen Brennan's cruiser pulled over the night before were speculating. Why had he stopped a judge? And why had they talked for so long? Captain Jenkins sat in his office, a frown etched on his face. He'd known Mike Brennan for years, considered him one of his best officers, but something was off. Brennan had called in sick today, the first time in years, and now there were rumors. Jenkins picked up his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Hey, it's me. We might have a situation brewing. Keep your ear to the ground." Back in Marcus's chambers, the judge and the officer were deep in discussion. They were no longer just two men on opposite sides of a divide. They were allies, united in a cause that was bigger than both of them. "We can't just reopen the case," Marcus explained. "The legal system doesn't work that way. But if we can find new evidence, if we can prove that there was misconduct." Brennan nodded eagerly. "I'm willing to testify, to admit my part in it all." Marcus held up a hand. "Slow down. This isn't just about you, Mike. This could implicate others on the force. It could blow the lid off years of corrupt practices." The reality of what they were considering began to sink in. This wasn't just about righting one wrong. It was about challenging an entire system, one that had been in place for generations. As they talked, the world outside continued to turn. In neighborhoods across the city, people went about their daily lives, unaware of the potential storm brewing. But in some corners, in hushed conversations and worried glances, a sense of unease was growing. Community leaders who had long fought against police brutality and systemic racism felt a shift in the air. Something was coming. They didn't know what, but they could feel it in their bones. In a small apartment across town, a young man named Jamal Thompson, no relation to the judge, was packing his bags. After 5 long years, he was finally coming home, but the world he was returning to was not the one he had left. He was angry, hurt, and scared. What place was there for him now? As the day wore on, Marcus and Brennan's conversation took on an urgent tone. They knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. Challenging the status quo always came with risks. We need to be smart about this, Marcus cautioned. If we move too fast, if we tip our hand too soon, the whole thing could backfire. Brennan nodded, his face set with determination. I understand, but I can't sit on this any longer. Every day that passes is another day that young man spends in prison for a crime he didn't commit. As they formulated a plan, neither man could shake the feeling that they were being watched. In a way, they were right. The ripples of their roadside conversation were spreading, touching lives they had never even met. In the courthouse cafeteria, clerks and lawyers huddled in small groups, trading rumors about the judge's mysterious visitor. In the police locker rooms, officers debated what could have caused one of their own to break rank. And in the mayor's office, a phone call was being made. We might have a situation, the voice on the line said. Keep this quiet for now, but be prepared. Things could get messy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Marcus and Brennan finally emerged from the judge's chambers. They parted ways with a handshake, each man carrying the weight of their decision. Marcus watched Brennan walk away, a mix of admiration and fear churning in his gut. They were about to embark on a journey that could change everything. But at what cost? As he turned to go back inside, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window. He saw a man standing at a crossroads, one path leading to safety and security, the other to uncertainty and danger. But he also saw a man who had sworn an oath to uphold justice, no matter the personal cost. With a deep breath, Marcus made his choice. There was no turning back now. The story of the judge and the officer was about to take a turn that would shake their city to its core. But as night fell over the streets they had sworn to serve and protect, neither man could have predicted just how far the echoes of their unlikely alliance would reach. The following weeks unfolded like a high-stakes chess game, with Judge Marcus Thompson and Officer Mike Brennan carefully planning their next moves. They met in secret, away from prying eyes, piecing together the evidence that would expose years of injustice. But as they dug deeper, the case became more complex, revealing a web of corruption that reached far beyond one wrongful conviction. Meanwhile, whispers of change rippled through the city. In the predominantly black neighborhood of Westside, community organizer Asa Johnson caught wind of unusual police activity. Officers who had once been aggressive were now hesitant, almost cautious in their interactions. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen. Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the rumors she'd heard about a judge and a cop. She'd spent years fighting against police brutality, organizing protests and pushing for reform. Now, it seemed like the tide might finally be turning, but experience had taught her to be wary of false hope. Across town, in the polished corridors of City Hall, Mayor Linda Hawkins was growing increasingly concerned. Her phone had been ringing off the hook with calls from worried police union representatives and influential donors. They'd all had the same message. Something was brewing in the police department, and it could be bad for business. Linda had built her career on being tough on crime while maintaining a facade of progressivism. She couldn't afford a scandal, not with re-election looming on the horizon. As she stared out her office window at the city skyline, she made a decision. Whatever was happening, she needed to control the narrative. Back at the precinct, Captain Jenkins was caught in the middle of a storm he didn't fully understand. He'd noticed changes in Brennan. The officer seemed distracted, almost haunted. And he wasn't the only one acting strange. There was a tension in the air, a sense that loyalties were shifting. Jenkins had always prided himself on running a tight ship. He turned a blind eye to certain practices over the years, justifying it as necessary for keeping the peace. But now, as he looked at the faces of his officers, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. As the investigation progressed, Marcus and Brennan found themselves facing unexpected allies and enemies. Sarah, Marcus's clerk, had become an invaluable asset, using her legal expertise to help build their case. But her involvement put her at risk, a fact that weighed heavily on Marcus's conscience. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the courthouse, she noticed a car following her. Heart pounding, she took a series of random turns, finally losing her tail in a crowded shopping district. As she leaned against a wall, catching her breath, she realized the stakes of what they were doing. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about challenging an entire system. Jamal Thompson, the young man at the center of the case, was struggling to adjust to life outside prison. He'd been released on parole, but freedom felt like a cruel joke. No one would hire him, his family relationships were strained, and he jumped at every police siren. When Brennan reached out to him, explaining that they were working to clear his name, Jamal's first instinct was to run. He learned the hard way not to trust cops, but as Brennan laid out the evidence, a spark of hope flickered in Jamal's chest. Could this be his chance at real justice? As days turned into weeks, the pressure began to mount. Marcus found himself under scrutiny from his peers on the bench. Subtle comments and sideways glances made it clear that word of his activities had spread. He knew his career could be on the line, but the faces of countless young men like Jamal, failed by the system he served, drove him forward. Brennan faced his own challenges. His fellow officers sensed his change in attitude, and the once friendly atmosphere of the precinct turned cold. He'd come home to find his uniform vandalized, a clear message from those who saw his actions as a betrayal. But every time he considered backing down, he remembered the look in Jamal's eyes, a mix of pain and fading hope that he couldn't ignore. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the coming storm. Community meetings grew more heated, with residents demanding answers about changing police behaviors. Journalists began sniffing around, sensing a big story but unable to pin down the details. In a dingy bar on the outskirts of town, a group of veteran cops gathered, their voices low and angry. They heard rumors about one of their own working with a judge, threatening to expose past misdeeds. Plans were made, threats were uttered. They'd protected their own for years, and they weren't about to stop now. As tensions rose, Aisa Johnson decided it was time to act. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting community members, police representatives, and city officials. The atmosphere was electric, years of pent-up frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. Mayor Hawkins attended, seeing an opportunity to gauge the public mood. But as she listened to story after story of police misconduct and systemic racism, she realized she was losing control of the narrative. Her carefully crafted image of a city in harmony was crumbling before her eyes. In the back of the room, Marcus and Brennan watched silently. They exchanged a glance, knowing that the moment to reveal their findings was drawing near. But they also knew that once they took that step, there would be no going back. The foundations of power in their city would be shaken, and the aftershocks could be devastating. As the meeting wound down, a young woman stepped up to the microphone. Her voice shook as she spoke about her brother, wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. In the crowd, Jamal Thompson felt a jolt of recognition. It was his sister, fighting for him even after all these years. The room fell silent as she finished her plea for justice. In that moment, the tension that had been building for weeks seemed to crystallize. Change was coming, whether the city was ready for it or not. Outside the community center, as people filed out into the cool night air, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Brennan, his face etched with determination. "It's time," the officer said quietly. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. As they walked away, neither man noticed the figure watching from the shadows, a phone pressed to their ear. "They're making their move," the voice whispered. "What do you want me to do?" The pieces were set, the players in position. The story of the judge and the officer was about to explode onto the national stage, with consequences that would reach far beyond the borders of their troubled city. But as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the question remained. In a world so deeply divided, could the truth really set them free? The morning after the town hall meeting, Judge Marcus Thompson woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. Texts, calls, and news alerts flooded his screen. His heart raced as he scrolled through the messages. Someone had leaked information about his investigation with Officer Brennan. The story was everywhere. Across town, Mike Brennan faced a similar onslaught. As he stepped out of his house, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about police corruption and cover-ups. He pushed through the crowd, his mind reeling. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. They weren't ready. At the courthouse, chaos reigned. Protesters gathered on the steps, their chants echoing through the marble halls. No justice, no peace. They cried, waving signs demanding accountability. Security guards struggled to maintain order as journalists jostled for position, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the judge at the center of the storm. Inside, Marcus barricaded himself in his chambers, his clerk Sarah acting as a buffer against the madness. "Judge," she said, her voice tight with worry, "what do we do now?" Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. It was Brennan. "We've been compromised," the officer said without preamble. "Someone got to our files. Everything's out there." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. "Meet me at the safe house," he said quietly. "It's time to go public with everything we have." As they ended the call, neither man realized they were being watched. In a sleek office downtown, Mayor Linda Hawkins leaned back in her chair, a grim smile on her face. "Well played, gentlemen," she murmured. "But you're not the only ones who know how to manipulate the media." With a few quick calls, Linda set her own plan in motion. She would position herself as the voice of reason, the leader who would guide the city through this crisis. But behind the scenes, her allies were working to discredit Marcus and Brennan, painting them as attention seekers trying to undermine public trust in law enforcement. Meanwhile, in the West Side neighborhood, Isa Johnson was mobilizing her network of activists. She knew this might be their only chance to push for real change. As she coordinated protest routes and safety measures, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We have info that can help. Meet at the old factory. Come alone." Aisha hesitated, knowing the risks, but the potential for crucial information was too great to ignore. With a deep breath, she grabbed her keys and headed out. At the precinct, Captain Jenkins found himself besieged by internal affairs investigators and union representatives. The station was in lockdown, with officers being questioned one by one. In the locker room, tensions boiled over. Fistfights broke out between cops who supported Brennan's actions and those who saw him as a traitor. Jamal Thompson watched the unfolding events with a mix of hope and fear. After years of feeling powerless, he now found himself at the center of a movement. But as camera crews showed up at his door, an old friend suddenly came calling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used as a pawn in a larger game. As the day wore on, the city seemed to hold its breath. Schools closed early, businesses shuttered their windows, and an uneasy quiet settled over the streets. Everyone was waiting, though for what, they weren't quite sure. In a nondescript apartment on the outskirts of town, Marcus and Brennan huddled over laptops, racing to organize their evidence. Years of meticulous investigation had led to this moment. Witness statements, financial records, body cam footage, all of it painting a damning picture of systemic corruption. "If we release this," Brennan said, his voice hoarse, "there's no going back. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" Marcus looked up, his eyes steely with determination. "I took an oath to uphold justice," he said. "It's time I lived up to that promise." As they worked, a breaking news alert flashed across the TV screen. Mayor Hawkins was holding an emergency press conference. They watched in disbelief as she spun a tale of rogue officials and unfounded accusations, calling for calm while subtly undermining their credibility. "She's trying to get ahead of the story," Sarah said, her fingers flying across her phone as she monitored social media reactions. "People are buying it. We need to move now." Just then, Brennan's police radio crackled to life. A series of coded messages. But one thing was clear: units were being mobilized across the city. "They're preparing for riots," Brennan translated, his face grim. As night fell, the city teetered on the edge of chaos. Protesters clashed with riot police in the downtown area. Social media exploded with conflicting reports and calls for action. In the mayor's office, Linda Hawkins received a troubling update. Someone had gotten their hands on sensitive documents implicating several high-ranking officials in years of cover-ups. At the old factory, Isa Johnson met her mysterious informant, a young officer who'd been part of Brennan's unit. He handed over a flash drive, his hands shaking. "This goes deeper than you know," he whispered before disappearing into the shadows. Back at the safe house, Marcus, Brennan, and Sarah made their final preparations. They had decided to live-stream their findings, bypassing traditional media to speak directly to the people. As they set up the camera, Marcus felt a moment of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Could the truth really set them free, or would it only lead to more violence? But as he looked at Brennan, at Sarah, at the faces of all those who had risked everything for justice, he knew there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he nodded to Sarah. "We're ready." As the live stream began, thousands across the city tuned in living rooms and street corners, on smartphones and giant screens in Times Square. People watched with bated breath. This was the moment of truth. Marcus faced the camera, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "My fellow citizens," he began, "what I'm about to share with you will shake the foundations of our city. But we can no longer hide from the truth. It's time for justice to prevail." As he spoke, the tension in the city reached a fever pitch. In the mayor's office, Linda Hawkins watched in horror as her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. On the streets, protesters and police alike paused. All eyes turned to screens large and small. And in a small apartment in the West Side, Jonald Thompson sat with his family, tears streaming down his face as he finally saw hope for redemption. The truth was coming out, but at what cost? As Marcus continued to speak, laying bare years of injustice and corruption, the city held its collective breath, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The story of the judge and the officer had reached its tipping point, but as the first shocking revelations hit the airwaves, no one could predict the chain reaction that was about to unfold. The truth was out there, but would it be enough to heal the deep-seated wounds of a divided city? The next few hours would determine the fate of not just Marcus and Brennan, but of an entire community fighting for change. As Judge Marcus Thompson's livestream revelations sent shockwaves through the city, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. Midway through his exposé, the feed suddenly cut out, plunging viewers into confusion. Frantic attempts to reconnect failed, and panic began to spread. In the safe house, Marcus, Brennan, and Sarah scrambled to understand what had happened. "We've been hacked," Sarah exclaimed, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Someone's trying to shut us down." Just then, Brennan's police radio crackled to life. Through the static, they heard fragments of an all-units call. Something big was happening downtown. "We need to get out there," Brennan said, his face grim. "Whatever's going on, it's not a coincidence." As they hurried to leave, Marcus's phone rang. It was Aisha Johnson. "Judge, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Meet me at the old courthouse, and be careful, the streets are chaos." Across the city, the abrupt end to the live stream had ignited a powder keg of tension. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the judge had been arrested, others that he'd been silenced by corrupt officials. Protesters poured into the streets, their peaceful demonstrations quickly turning heated as conflicting information circulated. In City Hall, Mayor Linda Hawkins was in crisis mode. The live stream had dealt a severe blow to her carefully crafted narrative, but its sudden cut-off presented an opportunity. "Spin this," she barked at her team. "Paint them as unreliable, as fearmongers stirring up trouble with half-truths and theatrics." But even as her staff worked to control the narrative, Linda received a call that made her blood run cold. The mysterious informant who had been feeding her information about Marcus and Brennan's investigation was demanding a meeting. "I have something that will end this once and for all," the voice on the phone said, "but my silence comes with a price." Meanwhile, Jonald Thompson found himself thrust into the spotlight. As word spread that he was the young man at the center of the judge's revelations, reporters camped outside his home. But it wasn't just the media's attention he'd attracted. A sleek black car had been parked across the street for hours, its tinted windows concealing the occupants watching his every move. As Marcus, Brennan, and Sarah navigated the chaotic streets, they were stunned by the scale of the unrest. What had started as isolated protests had swelled into a citywide movement. At major intersections, demonstrators faced off against lines of riot police. The air was thick with tear gas and the sound of helicopters circling overhead. "This is exactly what we were trying to prevent," Marcus said, his voice heavy with regret. "We wanted justice, not more violence." When they finally reached the old courthouse, they found Aisha waving, her face etched with worry. "You're not going to believe this," she said, leading them inside. In the cavernous main hall, they found a group of young hackers huddled around laptops. "We intercepted some communications," one of them explained. "Someone's planning to plant evidence, to make it look like your whole investigation was fabricated. They're going to discredit everything you've done." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Just when they thought they'd finally exposed the truth, their opponents had found a way to twist it against them. "There's more," Aisha added, her voice low. "We think we know who's behind this, but you're not going to like it." Before she could elaborate, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the building. Outside, a group of masked individuals was approaching, their intentions clearly hostile. "We need to move, now," Brennan said, his cop instincts kicking in, but as they turned to leave, they realized they were trapped. The front entrance was blocked by the approaching mob, and smoke was starting to billow from the back of the building. Someone had started a fire. In that moment of crisis, surrounded by chaos of their own making, Marcus and Brennan exchanged a look of grim determination. They had started this fight for justice, and now they would have to see it through, no matter the cost. As the smoke thickened and shouts grew closer, they knew they were facing not just a physical threat, but a moral crossroads. The truth they had fought so hard to expose was in danger of being buried forever. With time running out and enemies closing in from all sides, they had to make a decision that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of their entire community. The story of the judge and the officer had taken a dark turn, spiraling beyond their control. As they stood in the smoke-filled hall of the old courthouse, the weight of their choices pressed down on them. The city teetered on the brink of chaos, and the truth hung by a thread. In the coming moments, they would be tested like never before, forced to confront the consequences of their quest for justice in ways they never could have imagined. With sirens wailing in the distance and the crackle of flames growing louder, Marcus, Brennan, and their allies faced a pivotal moment. The next steps they took would not only determine their own fates but potentially reshape the entire narrative of their struggle. As they steeled themselves for what was to come, one question burned in their minds. In a world where truth seemed more fragile than ever, how far would they go to ensure justice prevailed? Smoke filled the old courthouse as Marcus, Brennan, Aisha, and their allies huddled together, the sound of breaking glass and angry shouts growing closer. "We need to get this information out," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the chaos. "It's our only chance to set the record straight." Brennan nodded, his cop instincts kicking in. "I've got an idea, but it's risky. There's an old tunnel system under the courthouse. If we can reach it, we might have a shot at broadcasting from a secure location." As they made their way through the smoky halls, Aisha's phone buzzed. It was Jamal. "The guys in the black car," he whispered urgently. "They're feds. They say they can help, but we need to move fast." The group exchanged wary glances. Could they trust this unexpected offer of help? With time running out and no other options, they decided to take the chance. Guided by Brennan's knowledge of the building's layout, they descended into the musty tunnels. The sounds of the riot above faded, replaced by the echo of their footsteps and ragged breathing. Meanwhile, across town, Mayor Linda Hawkins paced her office, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't care what it takes," she hissed. "Find them and shut this down. Now." But even as she spoke, her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Unbeknownst to her, her own staff had been quietly gathering evidence of her corruption for months. Inspired by Marcus and Brennan's bravery, they had decided to take a stand. Back in the tunnels, the group emerged into an abandoned subway station. To their surprise, they found Jamal waiting with a team of federal agents. "We've been investigating corruption in the city for years," the lead agent explained. "Your case broke it wide open. We're here to help you finish what you started." With the Fed's resources and protection, Marcus and Brennan were able to set up a secure broadcast. This time, there would be no interruptions. As they went live, the city held its breath. Marcus and Brennan laid out their evidence methodically, backed up by the federal investigation. They exposed a web of corruption that went far beyond a single wrongful conviction, implicating high-ranking officials, including Mayor Hawkins. But the real bombshell came when Brennan stepped forward. "I'm not just here to expose others," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm here to confess my own part in this broken system. For years, I was part of the problem. It's time for all of us to take responsibility and work towards real change." His raw honesty struck a chord. Across the city, people who had been on the verge of violence paused, moved by this unexpected act of accountability. As the broadcast continued, something remarkable happened. Police officers, inspired by Brennan's courage, began stepping forward with their own stories. The thin blue line, long used to protect corruption, was crumbling in real time. In City Hall, Mayor Hawkins watched in disbelief as her own staff turned on her, presenting evidence of her misdeeds to the authorities. Her phone, once constantly buzzing with calls from powerful allies, fell silent. The climax came when Marcus revealed the final piece of the puzzle: evidence linking the wrongful convictions to a larger scheme of for-profit prisons and kickbacks. The scope of the corruption was staggering, reaching to the highest levels of state government. As the broadcast ended, a hush fell over the city. The riots quieted, replaced by a sense of shocked awakening. People gathered in homes and public spaces, trying to process the revelations. In the days that followed, arrests were made, resignations tendered, and promises of reform echoed through the halls of power. Marcus and Brennan found themselves hailed as heroes by some, vilified by others. But they knew their work was far from over. The true twist came a week later during a public forum on police reform. As Marcus and Brennan took the stage, ready to discuss next steps, a young woman stood up in the audience. "I'm the daughter of a man wrongfully convicted 20 years ago," she said, her voice shaking. "Your courage inspired me to dig into his case. I found evidence that could exonerate him, and it implicates some of the same people you've exposed." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The path to true justice would be long and fraught with challenges. As Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, hopeful, angry, determined, he realized that their actions had sparked something bigger than themselves. A movement for accountability and reform that would ripple out far beyond their city. Brennan stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Ready for round two?" he asked with a grim smile. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the glimmer of hope in equal measure. "Let's get to work," he said, as they left the stage, surrounded by a mix of cheers and uncertain murmurs. One thing was clear. The story of the judge and the officer had opened a door that could never be closed again. The fight for justice would continue, with new allies, new challenges, and the understanding that true change comes not from a single moment of triumph, but from the ongoing commitment to do what's right, no matter the cost. In the weeks following the public forum, Marcus Thompson and Mike Brennan found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of change. The city, once teetering on the brink of chaos, was now engaged in difficult but necessary conversations about justice, accountability, and reform. The young woman's revelation about her father's case had opened a floodgate. Suddenly, people from all walks of life were coming forward with their own stories of injustice, each one a thread in the complex tapestry of systemic corruption they were working to unravel. Marcus, no longer able to serve as a judge due to his involvement in the case, threw himself into the work of reviewing potentially tainted convictions. He set up a volunteer legal clinic, enlisting law students and retired attorneys to help sift through decades of cases. The work was grueling, often heartbreaking, but every exoneration felt like a step towards healing. Brennan, for his part, faced a different kind of challenge. Many of his fellow officers saw him as a traitor, and he often found himself isolated at the precinct. But slowly, a small group of like-minded cops began to rally around him. Together, they started pushing for changes from within, better training, more community engagement, and a zero-tolerance policy for corrupt practices. Isa Johnson's grassroots organization grew exponentially, becoming a powerful voice for community oversight and police reform. She worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served, organizing town halls and joint community service projects. Jamal Thompson, once a symbol of the system's failures, became an unlikely spokesperson for second chances. He spoke at schools and community centers, sharing his story and encouraging young people to believe in the possibility of change. His sister, inspired by the movement, decided to go to law school, determined to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The city itself was transforming. The new mayor, elected on a platform of transparency and reform, worked closely with Marcus, Brennan, and their allies to implement sweeping changes. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers. An independent review board was established to investigate complaints of police misconduct. Community policing initiatives were expanded, with a focus on building trust and understanding between officers and the neighborhoods they patrolled. But the road to reform was not without its bumps. Resistance came from unexpected quarters. Some community members, distrustful after years of mistreatment, were skeptical of any police-led initiatives. Older officers, set in their ways, pushed back against new policies they saw as hindering their ability to do their jobs. There were setbacks and moments of doubt. A high-profile case fell apart due to mishandled evidence, leading to accusations that the new systems were making the city less safe. Budget constraints threatened to derail some of the more ambitious reform projects. Through it all, Marcus and Brennan stayed committed to their vision of a more just system. They became frequent collaborators, their unlikely partnership a symbol of the change they were working towards. They didn't always agree. Their different backgrounds and perspectives often led to heated debates. But their shared commitment to doing what was right kept them moving forward. 1 year after their initial revelations, they found themselves back in the public eye as the state legislature debated a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill inspired by their work. As they prepared to testify, Marcus reflected on how far they'd come. "You know," he said to Brennan, "when this all started, I thought exposing the truth would be enough. I had no idea how hard the real work would be." Brennan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Change isn't a moment, it's a process. We're just getting started." As they entered the packed hearing room, they were met with a mix of supportive cheers and angry jeers. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The hearing itself was intense, with powerful interests arguing against the proposed reforms. But when Jamal Thompson took the stand, his quiet dignity and powerful story of redemption seemed to shift the mood in the room. By the end of the day, it was clear that while the bill might need some adjustments, the momentum for change was unstoppable. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of their actions continued to spread. Other cities began reaching out, looking to implement similar reforms. A national conversation about the role of policing in society gained new urgency and nuance. Marcus found himself traveling the country, speaking at law schools and bar associations about the importance of ethical leadership in the justice system. Brennan became a sought-after consultant on police reform, helping departments across the state implement new training programs and accountability measures. But it was in the small, everyday moments that the real impact of their work could be seen. A young officer de-escalating a tense situation instead of resorting to force. The judge taking the time to really listen to a defendant's story before passing sentence. Community members and police officers working side by side on neighborhood improvement projects. 2 years to the day after their fateful traffic stop, Marcus and Brennan met for coffee at a small diner in the heart of the city. As they looked out the window at the bustling street, they could see subtle signs of change. Community bulletin boards advertising police community basketball games, posters for town hall meetings on local issues. "We've come a long way," Marcus said, a hint of pride in his voice. Brennan nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "We have, but there's still so much to do." Just then, a young woman approached their table, hesitation in her steps. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Judge Thompson and Officer Brennan?" They nodded, exchanging a curious glance. "I just wanted to say thank you," she continued. "My brother was one of the people exonerated because of your work. He's home now, trying to rebuild his life. What you did, it gave our family hope again." As she walked away, Marcus and Brennan sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, Brennan spoke. "You know, there are days when I wonder if it was all worth it. The stress, the danger, the way our lives have changed. But moments like that, that's why we do this." Marcus nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "And that's why we keep going. There's still work to be done." As they left the diner, stepping out into the bright sunlight, they knew that their journey was far from over. The path to true justice and equality was long and winding, with many obstacles still to overcome. But they had sparked a change, lit a flame that was now burning in hearts and minds across the city and beyond. The story of the judge and the officer had become something bigger than themselves, a testament to the power of truth, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. As they walked down the street, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, they carried with them the hope of a city transformed and the knowledge that even the smallest act of integrity could ripple out to change the world.